So my brothers and my sisters, as we embrace this urgency of creating the beloved community, now is the time to be loved. Love means understanding redemptive goodwill toward all which seeks nothing in return. So be loved by implementing the demands of justice to eliminate the school to prison pipeline that has so many black children entrapped. Be loved by correcting voting policies that seek to suppress the votes of millions of black and brown people. Be loved and implement the demands of justice by transforming a society that is disproportionately violent toward black lives, including black transgendered lives and indigenous lives. Be loved and correct false narratives and economic policies that continue to divide and pit poor and working class black and white people against each other. Be loved and implement demands of justice where systems and structures are deconstructed and lead the way of living in community that reimagines just, humane, equitable, and sustainable policies, practices, and behaviors. Love your enemies. Bless them that curse you. Do good to them who hate you, and pray for them that despitefully use you and abuse you. Be loved and do justice and love mercy and walk humbly with our God.
The King Center's beloved Community Leadership Academy is excited about the opportunity to help students recognize and develop their potential to become nonviolent leaders in industries such as technology, innovation, business, and entrepreneurship. Students will have the opportunity to engage in networking opportunities with business professionals and representatives from the King Center, universities, Fortune 500 companies, and civic leaders who will empower today's youth with the skills to effectively implement Dr. King's philosophy and methodology of nonviolence. The beloved Community Leadership Academy is committed to developing the next generation of compassionate, courageous, and conscientious nonviolent leaders to solve pressing world issues. For more information and to apply, please visit www.thekingcenter.org/Leadership Academy.
Namaste. Welcome. I am Dr. Rajni Shankar-Brown, professor and the Jessie Ball DuPont Endowed Chair of Social Justice Education at Stetson University, president of the board of the National Coalition for the Homeless, educator, scholar, poet, artist, activist, and most importantly, Amma, which means mom in Tamil, my family's language from South India, which remains one of the most ancient or oldest languages in the world, still spoken today. I am so grateful for the King Center and to be in community today to focus on ending anti-Asian hate, ending anti-Asian discrimination, violence in the United States and our world. And most importantly, to collectively call for beloved community, to be love. Over the past couple of years, the United States has been forced to do some self-reflection on its history of racism, including its relationship with the Asian American and Pacific Islander, AAPI, community. In 2021, anti-Asian hate crime skyrocketed, fueled by anger surrounding the origins of COVID-19. One study found that anti-Asian hate crimes rose by 339% last year. And of course, it is so important for all of us to also consider how anti-Asian violence in the United States is deeply intertwined with long imperial and colonial legacies embedded in systems and structures and policies. But before we jump into tonight's conversation, I want to provide a little more context for our viewers from a historical perspective. Now, please keep in mind, this is merely a snapshot, not all the history of anti-Asian hate in the United States. The sad reality is that the sentiments of anti-Asian hate dates back to over 150 years, starting with what was referred to as the Yellow Peril, and anti-Asian rhetoric and violence toward Chinese immigrants, leading to the Chinese massacre of 1871 in Los Angeles, which resulted in lynchings of dozens of Chinese men and boys who at the time represented close to 10% of the Chinese population in Los Angeles. As other immigrants expressed discontent with Chinese laborers and concerns similar to what we hear expressed today regarding job replacement fears, the Chinese Exclusion Act was enacted in 1882. But it was not repealed until 1943. And it led to massive decline of Chinese immigrants being allowed to enter the United States. As Japanese immigrants began to increase in numbers, we saw similar anti-Asian rhetoric and violence rise against their communities as well, leading to the Japanese internment camps, which was enacted by Executive Order 9066. Japanese immigrants and those born in the United States were stripped of their rights, homes, businesses, and all under the guise of them being a threat to US security. Now, one might say that was so long ago, but actually, the Executive Order 9066 was not repealed until 1976, less than 50 years ago. We then move to the Asiatic Barred Zone Act, or the Immigration Act of 1917, which barred all immigrants from Middle East and Southeast Asia from entering the United States and expanded the list of undesirables, among other things. Due largely to the civil rights movement, we wouldn't see changes to this act until 1965 with the Immigration and Nationality Act. Now, for the sake of time, I'm going to jump us forward to the 9/11/2001 terror attacks. In the aftermath, North Americans of South Asian and Middle Eastern descent faced rampant racial profiling, hate crimes, and discrimination. This included Muslims, or those practicing the Islam faith, and those perceived to be Muslim or practicing Islam, including Sikhs and Hindus. The stereotyping that came out of 9/11 still often leads to South Asians, Muslims, Sikhs, and others continually being targeted as terrorists or threats. My own family has been targeted by hate crimes, and I can personally share the deep distress and trauma that I carry, my children carry, the pain. But I also want to share that we carry hope. Hope that we continue to hold and to grow forward. Hope that we will honor our shared humanity, that we will love more, hate less, and build Sangha, or beloved community. And even as we talk about ending anti-Asian hate in North America and around the world, we must work to dismantle hate and intersectional forms of oppression that show up in our systems, our structures, our policies, our practices, our interactions with one another. For example, the intertwined realities of race and ethnicity and homelessness and the systemic nature of racial disparities impacting Black and Brown communities include an overrepresentation of AAPI communities. And this is not often even captured in data. In fact, as the president of the board for the National Coalition for the Homeless, we are sifting through data now. And currently, Pacific Islanders experience the highest rate of homelessness in the United States when you look compared to population size, 9 times as likely to experience homelessness than the general population. Deeply distressing, heartbreaking, unacceptable, but again, we can collectively change these daunting narratives. Hope is embodied in our agency, empathy, love, and action. Love is a manifestation of justice, and justice is a manifestation of love with faithful roots of community, nourished and sustained by hope. And that hope, I feel, also brings us together today, this evening, for the King Center's beloved community talk. As Mahatma Gandhi wrote, love is the strongest force the universe possesses. And Dr. King so wisely reminded us, let us not seek to satisfy our thirst for freedom by drinking from a cup of bitterness or hatred. And he said, told us, reminded us, taught us, showed us that hate cannot drive out hate. Only love can do that. I firmly believe that ending hate and violence in all forms, including ending anti-Asian hate in the United States and in our world, merits our collective attention, calls on us to recognize our shared humanity, the inherent dignity and radiant spirit in every person, and that we are also called to continue marching. Our amazing guests tonight, I am sure, are familiar with this history and also understand the work to stop Asian hate goes well beyond the last couple of years and well beyond COVID-19. So I now want to invite our guests this evening to join me in this conversation, to share how they are working to stop Asian hate. Min Jin Lee is a recipient of fiction fellowships from the Guggenheim Foundation, the Radcliffe Institute of Advanced Study at Harvard, and the New York Foundation for the Arts. She is an accomplished author, a writer in residence at Amherst College, and serves as a trustee of PEN America, and is a director of the Authors Guild. Benny Luo, our second speaker today, is the founder of nextshark.com. It is a leading AAPI media company covering news, business, politics, entertainment, and culture. And it reaches over 20 million people per week across social platforms. Nextshark has been cited by the New York Times, the Washington Post, Forbes, BBC, CNN, Fox, and more, and it has led coverage of anti-Asian violence since the beginning of 2020. In 2018, Benny was inducted into the Forbes 30 Under 30 list in media. Min and Benny, welcome, welcome. Thank you both again for being here tonight, sharing your time and expertise. Namaste.
Namaste.
Namaste, thank you.
So I have some questions for us to kind of talk about tonight and dialogue on. And the first question, I'm hoping Min and Benny, you can tell the audience tonight, our community here, a little more about your own personal journeys as Asians in North America and why you feel it is important to be involved in stopping Asian hate. Min, would you like to start?
Sure. First of all, I want to thank you, Rajni, for setting the context of what we're discussing tonight. It's so very important to go through that timeline. And I know that you, in the interest of time, it was an abbreviated timeline, but it's so very important because I think the principal reason for racism against Asians, against anybody at all, is profound ignorance. And that ignorance really comes from the fact that our education system has really failed BIPOC. And I think that we have to consistently address that by resetting the narrative. So thank you for doing the work. Also, thank you for moderating us. It's a thankless task. And we will do our best to do our job here. In terms of my personal journey, just very briefly, I came to the United States in 1976 when I was 7. I grew up in a working class neighborhood of Elmhurst, Queens of New York. So I'm a native New Yorker, at least that's how I see it. And as a native New Yorker, I find it deeply distressing that of the 11,000 reported incidents of hate since the pandemic until the end of last year, the greatest majority of them really came from New York City. So when you are a New Yorker, when you are a city person, you are on the street, you are on the train, you are witnessing the extreme inequality of this country. And then you are seeing what happens when we interact with each other. And I think that from a small child until now, I feel very strongly that in order to see greater love, we need to have greater truth telling. We can't have that reconciliation without that truth. And it's uncomfortable to say these things. I mean, who wants to hear it? But unless we start talking about it, then we'll never really know each other.
Absolutely. Thank you so much, Min. Beautifully said. And it just makes me think about, even all of the talk right now with controlling curriculum and truthful history and how distressing it is, but also the dangerous implications that continue to grow forward. So I appreciate just what you shared and your commitment to this important work. Benny, would you like to share?
Yes. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Rajni, for having me on. Appreciate everybody at the King Center for this opportunity. Such an honor to be in the same panel as Min Jin, though. But anyways, I guess a little bit about me. I mean, I was born and raised in San Francisco to parents that came from mainland China. My mother was who you would call a freedom swimmer. So during the aftermath of the Cultural Revolution, my mom actually swam from mainland China to Hong Kong as a refugee to come to America. And it was a long journey for her. I mean, the first 2 times she actually got caught by the Red Guards and, had to go to jail, where she suffered a lot of, horrific experiences that she can't really talk about to this day. But even after that, like on the 3rd try, she actually made it. And, my family immigrated here in the mid 1980s. Didn't have very much growing up. I mean, I still remember I believe there's still home videos of me being like maybe just a couple months old, where I'm crawling around this one room that, my family had rented. And it was like 8 to 10 of us just sleeping on floors in our sleeping bags and stuff during that time. And, a lot of my memories and flashes, I guess, growing up was constantly seeing how busy my parents were all the time, always running around. I mean, they would, in order to make ends meet and assimilate and everything. I mean, they would get up at 5 a.m. to, go to work in the Chinese restaurants, take, buses across town and everything. And then at night at around like 7 o'clock, they would go to, English school to learn English. And they wouldn't get home until at least like 10 or 11 o'clock. And then from there, they still had to study. And then by the time they got into bed, it was already like, 12:31 a.m. And they would have to get ready again at like 5 a.m. in the morning. And it was this constant thing, right? And, hard work was instilled upon me, like definitely very early on. But even then, my parents were not immune to, a lot of the racism and discrimination, that they had to dealt with growing up, whether it was in public, whether it was in a work setting. And even for me during my academic years, even as early as, my elementary school years, I mean, most of the fights and incidents that I had involving me were racially motivated, and even in the early years, it's really weird. I've always been like a very, I think, observant, I guess you could say. And of course, growing up, I never really saw as much representation in various mediums of people that kind of look like me and everything. And, this concept of this idea of, why I want to get so involved in everything is that I think that as the years kind of go on, and now that I'm a new father, I became a father about a year ago. I want to build a better future, for our kids and everything. I mean, I think that my reasoning has evolved very, very quickly. In the past, it was kind of like, projecting these traumas, right? It's like, I want to do something, when I was younger, maybe I was too scared, or maybe I didn't know what I was, what to do, or whatever it is. But, and so I think back then it was definitely like much more like assertive in a sense, where it's like, hey, we have to stop this, I want to get myself involved, blah, 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 right? But nowadays, I look at it from a much more sort of different lens. And really, I think that for me, if we're stewards in this world in some way, our job is to try to make the world a better place in some aspect, right? It always has to lead with that framework. It always has to lead with love, most importantly, right? And I think that sets the groundwork for a lot of the work that I'm passionate in doing. So, yeah.
Beautiful. I love that, Benny. Thank you so much. And congratulations again on the journey of fatherhood too. And I love that is also part of your motivation and guiding compass now, right? To do this work, which is really important for all of our children, our world as a whole. Love that. So I'm going to ask you kind of, connected to some of the things that you actually kind of wove in and brought up here to our first question. But we know the model minority myth has been used repeatedly, to have racial groups be combative, especially, between Asians and Black or even South Asian Americans. You start to see how it's been used in ways to intentionally maybe even perpetuate, right, kind of divisiveness and combat. As we move to stop Asian hate, how do we also work to repair splintered relationships with communities that we may also marginalize with racism, right? So kind of a little bit of a heavier question here.
I think what's really interesting about what we're talking about is that we are deeply cognizant of the racism that we feel, but then also the racism that we perpetuate. I think it makes us really uncomfortable. I think one of the interesting things about being an Asian American in this country, a tent that is so enormous with so many different cultures and so many different experiences, I almost feel like your first question was really smart, because unless we start talking about how we got here and who we are, the idea of even a freedom swimmer, the fact that is not known in our lexicon, but it's so powerful, right? Mm-hmm. It's so powerful, and it totally transforms this idea of being, let's say, a boat person. Mm-hmm. We have all these terms, but a freedom swimmer indicates a person who's really resistant to authoritarian oppression, and therefore she is willing to fight for her freedom, and even at great risk to herself. She could have been killed and of course imprisoned. So when I think about that, and going back to your question and how do we participate in the racism, is that I also want to talk about the journey of how we import and export the class hierarchies, the colorism, and the history of imperialism that we have from the countries of origin. And we bring them here, as well as the fact that we learn those kinds of ideas that are deeply hateful, deeply ignorant, and then we perpetuate it against each other. Here we are talking about poverty. And when you have working class immigrants entering into communities, when we meet other communities of color, and we don't know how to deal with each other, we could be friends or we could be enemies. And I think that when we are enemies and we learn deeply racist things from a white supremacist educational system, that what ends up happening is that we start internalizing these horrible truths and these horrible, inconvenient lies as well. And then we start enacting them in our personal relationships. And this is why it's so interesting to think about love as a really radically revolutionary way to deal with this, because we could come from a position of defensiveness and also I'm only going to fight for what I want. Or are we really going to really rethink, what is it that I don't know? What did I bring from my home culture as well as from the nation of my origin or historically? And then also, this is really weird, but I have to say this, but so many of us do not wish to talk about poverty, do not wish to talk about the classes that we came from. We feel profound shame about war, about imperialism, because we associate that with shame and humiliation. And therefore, you have people who don't want to talk about it. And then there are many of us who wish to only talk about our successes. And that then we perpetuate our own model minority myth. And then we're surprised. Why do people not know about the homeless situation that you're talking about, which is so important? And I want to applaud you for talking about homelessness, because if you are in New York, it's so clear that Asian Americans are poor. And yet it's almost like we turn a blind eye to our own poverty, and then we perpetuate that cycle by not telling the truth about our own experiences, because we think, oh, there's class shame, and I don't want to experience the class shame in social relationships like marriage or education. And then, of course, we have some of the problems that we participate in ourselves.
Min, thank you for sharing that. Again, very, very insightful. And I think it really, a lot of what you just said resonates on so many levels. And I think about, coming at all of this work, including unpacking our own biases, our own internalized racism, the importance of cultural humility in all of this as well. Right. And, it's just, it's very interesting to think about. But I do think, love is this kind of revolutionary, powerful force in our world that has the capacity to change and advance justice. And we can never forget that. So thank you, Min. Benny, thoughts?
Oh, man, that is, how do I follow that? What do I have to say about this? I think that, it's one of those things where I don't think we can change what happened in the past, right? But I think it's really important that we know the past very deeply and to understand, how we kind of got here today. And I think, we all talk about, setting the right historical context, right? Like, why does the model minority myth exist, right? Why has that driven a wedge between, these different communities, right? And I think the why and the how and just understanding, these incidences that kind of led to today, because it wasn't like a switch went on and suddenly like this is what happened, right? This has been a gradual thing, piling, generation as kind of things go on, right? I think for me, I don't live life, thinking that I know everything, and especially on topics like this. I think that I'm learning something new every day with these sort of things. I think that the way I look at it is that in order to move the needle forward, you got to do it together. It can't just be just one person, one movement, right? I think Dr. King said it in his last book. I think where do we go from here is that you can't have this whole separatist sort of thing where just one group just advocates for them and themselves only, right? Mm-hmm. It's bigger than that, right? And if you look at history in the past, the changes that we have today is based on, so many different minority groups, like, working together and showing up for each other and helping each other out. And this dates back to as early as the late 1800s. Frederick Douglass, advocated for, Chinese and Japanese immigration, the person that fought all the way up to the Supreme Court where, so that, birthright citizenship exists, right, was Chinese American man, mm-hmm. right? There were people like Yuri Kochiyama and Grace Lee Boggs who worked hand in hand with all the biggest major civil rights leaders during that era, right? Reverend Jesse Jackson, himself lobbied to make sure that the murders of Vincent Chin found justice, right? So when it comes to enacting these sort of change, I think it's important to know that building coalitions and allyship and everything, it's not unprecedented. It's happened. It's been happening. You know what I mean? And I think that the only thing that we can continue doing is really making our own unique contributions, right? And it doesn't really matter who contributes more than the other. It's a group effort, and I think that if all of us can work together just to move that needle just a little bit forward, right? I feel like we've done, a good amount of our jobs, right? And all we got to do is keep it going, and we make sure that, we move it further for the next generation, just like the people before us have.
Yeah, I love that, Benny. Thank you for sharing. And bringing that up, right? This idea of the fusion of movements and communities and people, and that is vital to this work. I think about, I just, recently came back from DC, where I had the privilege and honor to be part of the Moral March on Washington by the Poor People's Campaign that Dr. King and through the Civil Rights Movement was really built. And it was amazing to see thousands of people gather, different races and ethnicities and languages and, religious diversity, the spectrum of diversity to come together. And the theme was actually Forward Together. And I think that fusion of our movements is so needed. And I love that you bring that up and highlighted that, Benny, in your response. The other thing I think about is again, that critical role, and Min, you said it so well about education, right? The role that education plays, even as you talk about the idea that we need to teach truthful history, make sure that, we are able to even recognize these dangerous lies that exist, that we're able to educate even around, even as we say Asian, again, the diversity, the rich, beautiful, radiant diversity that it's interesting we label and lump so often, but often I think that's also perpetuated some of the diminishment of communities within even the broader Asian community. So even I think about where I live in the state of Florida, our Hmong communities and poverty and homelessness. And that is not in our data or conversations at all, not even captured in ways. And it is so problematic. And we have to do better. And we can do better. I do believe that. So, our final question for tonight, and I'm just so honored, I have to say, to be able to share this space with both of you. Just such amazing individuals. So thank you. When we think about the beloved community, where do we need to go from here to get there? And how can each of us be working to build beloved community in both small and larger ways?
Rajni, I was thinking a lot about what you said. And when we think about a beloved community and about education, I keep thinking about how Dr. King really conceived of the World House. That's actually something that he really wrote about, and it has affected me through all of my life. And I want to talk about respect. So love sounds so abstract, and very often it's considered to be something romantic or too intense. But I think that one of the things that we don't do enough is just respect each other. And the reason why I think respect is so important is that if you go to poor neighborhoods, one of the most important things that people care about who don't have any money is you didn't respect me and I didn't respect you. You can hear young people talking about it all the time. Violence and murder happens for the lack of respect. I kind of think one of the most radical things that I think about when I teach my students and the way I approach my life is, how do I respect other communities of color by knowing more about their lives, their contributions, their culture, their language, their what troubles them? What do they want? What do they care about? So if we really want to build a world house filled with love, at the very, very least, we have to begin with that level of respect. So education and respect have to be integrated. And I think it's very exciting to think about it that way, rather than thinking, oh, bad things are happening and we have to fix them. And I always kind of think, if only humans were so mechanical and clever. We're not. Very often we're motivated by feelings of something very simple, like, the world doesn't respect me. How could you not respect me as my neighbor? So it's a gesture of even recognizing that that person is my neighbor and that person deserves respect. I'm your neighbor and I deserve respect. And if we could only know each other, then perhaps it would be a really powerful, powerful alliance. My only last thing that I'd love to say is, we are the fastest growing voting bloc.
Yes.
And in Atlanta in particular, it has been decisive if we can gather together. So for me, one of the things that I care about intensely is how do we garner this very powerful alliance of Asian Americans and all communities of color to press our agenda. We have a shared agenda of greater education, greater equity, greater justice. And I think that it's something that we can do with respect and love. Thank you.
I love it, Min. Respect, love, and vote. So important. I love it. Benny.
Oh man, I think I'm on the same camp as Min Jin here. I guess the way I would answer too is that, it's building like lasting friendships and bonds. It's not something that you can just like, it's not a transaction. It's something that each side has to really earn for each other. And I think that for me, it's really interesting. I kind of learned this concept from my wife. I mean, she's originally from Japan, and in Japan, like building a sense of community is so important. Knowing your neighbor and everything. I mean, when she got here and when she was like, "Hey, you don't talk to your neighbor," I'm like, "No, that's really weird. Why?" It's like she's like, "No, why wouldn't you talk to him? That you guys live together. You guys got, and." For her, like, really getting to know the people around her on a deep level was really, really important to her. And when certain things, when we needed help, sometimes even small things like taking out the garbage on vacation and everything. I mean, she had built up this awesome network of people around her. And, for her, even like when we moved into our new place in the neighborhood, I mean, she personally went out to get like little pastries and chocolates for, everybody in the neighborhood, and just to kind of introduce themselves. Like, wow, this seems very old school, but this is really cool at the same time. And I think that for me, I genuinely have an interest in meeting other people. I really like to know everybody else's stories. I think that, there's always a reason that, people act a certain way, and I'm not saying in a negative way or anything like that. And I think that oftentimes, a lot of people are misunderstood because there's no communication, right? And so I think for me, we can talk about solving problems all day or whatever it is, but I think at the end of the day, some of the best things you could really do is just meeting and getting to know the people who are around you. How are you doing today, right? I mean, how's life been, right? What are you into? This is what I'm into. I think that really starting off that basics really could set a strong framework for, great change and, great potential relationships in the future. So that's how I operate.
I love that. Thank you so much, Benny. That's great. And the idea of human relationships and taking time, what we've done tonight, right? Listening to each other and stories and conversations. There's an old Sanskrit saying about how you can solve so much and actually push forward so much goodness in the world by sitting down with others over a good cup of chai, right? And just this idea of coming together, and sharing. Well, I really want to thank Min Jin, Benny. It has been a joy to share this evening with both of you. Thank you so much. Back at you. Thank you so much tonight for the great conversation. I also want to thank everybody who's participating, engaging, supporting the King Center, and I'm part of the King Center's beloved community talks. I know tonight that we focused on stopping Asian hate. I also know that in order for us to get to beloved community, it will require us coming together to end all forms of hate and oppression and work collectively with revolutionary love to advance intersectional equity and justice. In the words of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., human progress is neither automatic nor inevitable. Every step towards the goal of justice requires sacrifice, suffering, struggle, the tireless exertions and passionate concern of dedicated individuals. Although Dr. King acknowledged that conflict may exist in beloved community, Dr. King also reminded us that hate cannot. We have the opportunity to reflect on how we are either working to end racism or how we are even intentionally or unintentionally perpetuating racism. We can all explore how we can be true allies, fueled by love, a theme tonight that we've certainly talked about. How we can all be co-conspirators for justice with any one person or community that is not afforded equity and justice. How we can honor stories, learn about others and their family stories, like Benny's mom, who was a freedom swimmer. How we can also remember to tackle and to push for truthful history, as Min Jin so beautifully reminded us tonight. Let us educate ourselves and our communities with intention. Let us love more fiercely, and let us work together to realize a sustainable, global, beloved community. Let us be Sangha, beloved community. Let us be love. Namaste.